one thing that I've noticed is that there are a lot of people who are praising the murder of Brian Thompson by Luigi Mangione. And they will say, well, the reason why it was justified is because Brian Thompson was the CEO of United Health, and his company denied people the medical coverage that they needed. And so people who died because they did not receive the medical coverage that they needed, their hands were, or their blood was on the hands of Brian Thompson, and so therefore Luigi Mangione is a hero. And so because this type of rhetoric is so popular, what that tells me is that terrorism is now seen as acceptable by a lot of people in American society. And once you start seeing this sort of rhetoric becoming so popular, it really is a return to fanaticism. It is a return to a fanatical way of thinking that was very, very common back in the 20th century, back in the mid-20th century, back in the early 20th century, and before that. You can go back to the late 18th century and read about the French Revolution. You can go back to the 100 Years' War and read about the peasant revolts that were very, very common in medieval France. You can read about all of the plethora of peasant revolts that happened in Europe. And so what we're seeing in America is this gradual revival and this gradual return of this way of thinking. Because when we read about peasant revolts, we're almost always reading about events that took place in the Middle Ages, or we are reading about events that took place back in the 1800s or the 1700s or the 1900s. So we can go back to the French Revolution. And in the French Revolution, the rebels believed in mass murder. They believed in murdering as many people as they wanted, as long as it was done under the guise of trying to help humanity. So they wanted to murder, right? They wanted to commit mass murder. They were bloodthirsty. They were just evil people. But they did so, they orchestrated murder under a pretext. And the pretext was that these people who we are killing are somehow a part of the monarchy which we want to take down, or we have already taken down, or these people are against our revolution, which is for the betterment of humanity. And so therefore these people who we are going to murder are enemies of humanity. They are enemies of this great project to better humanity. And so we saw this, or I wasn't there, none of us were there, but the world saw this back in the French Revolution. During the French Revolution, people were murdered because they were against the French Revolution. The French Revolution was this giant rebellion that presented itself as being for the working man, as being for the average person, as being for the average Frenchman or Frenchwoman. And so they presented themselves as enemies of the monarchy. So the monarchy was evil, the king was tyrannical, the queen was indifferent towards the suffering of the peasantry, and the church was a friend of the monarchy. And so because the church was connected to the monarchy, therefore the church needed to be destroyed, and the priest needed to be killed or forced to conform to the ideology of the revolution. And so they butchered tons of priests and nuns, and they butchered tons of Catholics. They killed hundreds of thousands, at least hundreds of thousands of people, because they were deemed as counter-revolutionary, or they were counter-revolutionary, but they were deemed as enemies of the French people because they disagreed with the French Revolution. And if you were to go back to those days and ask these murderers, why are you killing all of these people? They would say, well, it's because too many French people are too poor and the king doesn't care about them. Or the French people, the poor people, the peasants in France are in a terrible situation, and the price of bread has gone up, and so this has made living so much more difficult for the peasant class, and the king doesn't care. The king, in fact, is behind all these problems, all of the suffering that the peasants are going through. So we have to kill the king, behead the queen, and the church is an ally of the monarchy, an ally of the king. So we need to destroy the church. And if you are a Catholic and you disagree with what we are doing, we are going to kill you. And so everything was done, as evil as it was, everything was done under the guise of trying to better humanity. Now, we can fast forward to the 20th century and we can read about the Bolshevik Revolution. In the Bolshevik Revolution, one of the big enemies was the kulaks. The kulaks were a people who were not super rich, but they weren't poor either. They were right in the middle. And they were essentially small landowners. That's what they were. So they were kind of like landlords today, but they owned small amounts of land. They would own some land and they would have people work the land, and so they were seen as an enemy of the peasants because they owned land and people worked the land, and they were also accused of hoarding food that could have otherwise been given to the poor, and so they were seen as just the evilest of the evil, and they were butchered. And the Bolsheviks did really an act of genocide on the kulaks, and they butchered hundreds of thousands of people because they were kulaks. And you can look into this. It's called dekulakization. And that's what the Bolsheviks did. And I believe it was Vladimir Lenin who stated that I need not investigate someone to determine if he is worthy of death. All I need to do is find out what class they are a part of. And if they are a part of a certain class that I have deemed as an enemy, then they are worthy of death. And they will be put to death. That was his mentality. That was it. And with that mentality came the deaths of countless lives. So fast forward to our own time, and we see what? We see this story of the CEO of United Health being killed, and the killer is now a hero. And I'm not saying that everyone in America is saying that Luigi Mangione is a hero, but I'm saying that too many people see him as a hero and are praising him as a hero. And the fact that his act of murder is so popular tells me that terrorism is now seen as something acceptable in American society. Terrorism is now cool. That's what's happening. And so that fanaticism of the past, that fanaticism of those very dark events in human history, the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, that fanaticism is gradually manifesting itself in American society. And you see it returning back in the Western world. You see it in Western Europe. So, for example, back in 2018 and in 2019, you had the Yellow Vest movement in France. And the Yellow Vesters were fanatics, and they were very, very popular. And those demonstrations were very, very popular. It started out as a demonstration over diesel tax, over a taxation on diesel, but it escalated quickly to being demonstrations on other things, and you had the far right being involved, the far left being involved, And then it didn't take very long for these demonstrators to start expressing their murderous desires. You had people putting up mock guillotines. And what was that about? That was about killing politicians. They wanted to behead Emmanuel Macron. So what was that? That was an example of this sort of fanaticism that we associate with the past coming back to the present. And so what's all of this praise for Luigi Mangione about? It's really a sign that fanaticism is returning. That's what that is. And I've talked about this many times, and in fact, I have been talking about this subject for years. 4 years. Going all the way back to, when I was in high school, I was working on a book called For God or for Tyranny. It's still out. You can get it on Amazon. It's a very old book. Came out. It was published in, I want to say 2010 or 2009. But I started working on the book, I want to say in 2008 or 2007. I don't remember. But it was one of those years I started working on it. And that book was about all of the ideologies that present themselves as good, that present themselves as being for the betterment of humanity, when the reality is that they're just destructive and evil. And in the book, I talked about the French Revolution, and I also talked about the Bolshevik Revolution, and I talked about the Mexican Revolution. I talked about all these revolutions that presented themselves as being good for people, and how these revolutions were being pushed by their acolytes as being for the betterment of humanity, and how once these revolutionaries took power, they became utter tyrants. They became absolutely diabolical. So you go to the French Revolution, very, very obvious it's very obvious how evil the French Revolution was. I mean, just the indiscriminate massacring of people by the hundreds of thousands, taking people because they disagreed with the revolution and drowning them to death, drowning them by the thousands, guillotining people by the thousands, and just committing horrendous acts of mass murder, raping people, cannibalism in some cases. There were cases of cannibalism. There was one case where a woman was, she was I think part of the royal family, or she had some sort of a position in the French government. I don't remember, but she was, let's just say that she was amongst the elite circles at the time, and the mob overtook her, and there was one guy who I think grabbed her heart. Pulled her heart out and just started eating it. This happened several times, numerous times during the French Revolution, because it was demonic. It was absolutely demonic. When I got out of high school, I started, of course, I started to look more into this history, and that research went into the writing of my book, and eventually it was published. I want to say in 2009 or 2010. But after that book was published, not too long after that book was published, you had the Egyptian Revolution. And when that revolution was happening, I made the parallel between the Egyptian Revolution and the French Revolution. And I said, okay, people thought the French Revolution was good. And I said, the French Revolution was evil, and right now people are thinking that the Egyptian Revolution is good, but it's not. It's Islamist, it's jihadist, and it's destructive. And eventually you had Mohammed Morsi take power in Egypt, and he wanted to impose Sharia law. And so I said, look, people thought the Egyptian Revolution was great, but Mohammed Morsi has taken power. The Egyptian Revolution has taken power. And what do the rebels want to do? They want to impose tyranny, despotism. And so, of course, I made the parallel with the French Revolution. The French revolutionaries said that they wanted to overthrow tyranny. But once they took control, they became despotic. They began to impose tyranny. They began to bring about tyranny. Mass murder, rape, cannibalism. I mean, just an absolute nightmare, right? Just absolute horror. That's what the French Revolution was. Now, thankfully, Morsi was overthrown, and then Sisi was put in power. But nonetheless, the Egyptian Revolution brought about this Muslim Brotherhood government. And then you talk about something worse than the Egyptian Revolution. You talk about the Syrian Revolution. And when the Syrian Revolution began to happen, I was looking into it. And of course, I made the parallel between the Syrian Revolution and the French Revolution. And I said, look, people thought the French Revolution was great. And people right now are thinking that the Syrian Revolution is a good thing because Bashar al-Assad is so bad and tyrannical. And people were saying the same thing about the French monarch. But the rebels who were demonizing the French monarch were much worse than the monarch. And once their numbers got big enough, they began this horrendous slaughterhouse in the streets of France. And the Syrian rebels were doing the same thing. And they are doing the same thing right now as we speak. But I made the parallel between the Syrian Revolution and the French Revolution. And just as the world saw cannibalism being done in the French Revolution, cannibalism was done in the Syrian Revolution. And there was that infamous video of a Syrian rebel ripping someone's organ, I think it was either his liver or his heart, and eating it raw. And that sort of evil was done in the French Revolution because it's the same demons. But the thing is that people present terrorism as something that is good, and the way that they do that is by pointing out an abuse or pointing out some sort of a sin, some sort of a wrongdoing. So they will say the health insurance business is abusive, and you can absolutely point to abuses done by health insurance companies. But the problem is, and you know what I'm going to say, it's very obvious what the problem is. The problem is people will point to those abuses to justify more abuses. And that is the obvious reality that really confronts people who subscribe to this way of thinking. So they'll say, well, Bashar al-Assad was bad. Bashar al-Assad was so bad. He was so tyrannical. He was despotic. He was a murderer. And yes, Bashar al-Assad was a tyrant. Yes, Bashar al-Assad did abuses, or his regime did abuses. Absolutely. But what the hell are these rebels doing? Right? So they'll say, well, Bashar did murder. Bashar did torture. He did these bad things. Okay, well, that means that the rebels who are making these accusations are going to be the opposite of that, right? So the rebels say Bashar was tyrannical, he was a murderer. So that means that the rebels are going to be the opposite of what they accuse Bashar of. And that's not the case. What you see the rebels doing is what? Murder, torture, rape, mass executions, just butchery. So I don't understand. You're saying that Bashar did all these bad things, but here you are doing the bad things that you accused Bashar of doing. So what does this tell us? What it tells us is that these people will point to the misgivings of others or the wrongdoings of others to justify the evils that they want to do. And that's what you have to keep in mind before, or really, that's what you need to think about before you jump into this pool of fanaticism that we're seeing building up, that we're seeing being cultivated. That's the issue. So before you start having this knee-jerk reaction and automatically subscribing to the ideology of the acolytes of fanaticism, keep in mind that what these people do and what they always have done throughout history is pointing to the abuse of others to justify abuse. So if your goal is to have a more healthy society, or a society that is more free, or a society that is thriving, or a society that is righteous or moral, then don't follow people who are for the opposite of those things. So if you're against despotism and tyranny, don't follow people who are for despotism and tyranny. So they'll say, well, Bashar was tyrannical, but yet the rebels are tyrannical. In fact, they're more tyrannical than Bashar al-Assad. And I saw a video today, yesterday actually. It was just absolutely horrendous. It showed rebels going into a hospital in Syria and just shooting hospital patients. And these were, I'm guessing these were soldiers who were wounded in battle before Bashar al-Assad was toppled. And so they were just lying on their hospital beds, and these rebels just go in there and in cold blood murder them. And so I will say, wow, this is murder. This is absolutely evil and horrendous. But then what happens is the pro-Syrian revolution people, the people who are sympathetic towards the Syrian revolution, they will come out and say, but Bashar was so bad. But these rebels who you are praising are committing murder in this hospital. They're murdering these people. So how can you say that you are against Bashar because Bashar was a murderer, but while at the same time supporting murder? So that's, and the problem is, if I say, hey, the Syrian revolution is wrong, or hey, the praising of Luigi Mangione is wrong, what do people always do as a response? They will always say, Bashar al-Assad did this, or United Health did that. Okay, United Health did wrong. Okay, Bashar al-Assad's regime did wrong, but what are you doing? You're praising murder. You're praising a murderer, or you're praising murderers. If you're praising the Syrian revolution, you're praising murderers. You're praising Jabhat al-Nusra. Jabhat al-Nusra is a murderous terrorist organization, and now they're running things in Syria, because Syria right now is being dominated by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, and HTS is just, it's Jabhat al-Nusra. That's it. It's the new name for Jabhat al-Nusra. And Jabhat al-Nusra was founded as the official Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda. And so you got rid of Bashar, but now you have Al-Qaeda. Now you have ISIS. So if you wanted to topple Bashar because you were against tyranny, then why in the hell would you support the Syrian revolution, which is tyrannical, which has now ushered in this Al-Qaeda government? People do this all the time. They point to one evil to justify another. And another thing that people do is they try to present evil as righteous, or they try to present evil people as righteous when those people are actually just evil. So, for example, I was reading about Hans Frank today. Hans Frank was the governor. He was the highest governor in German-occupied Poland. He held the highest rank amongst all the Nazi governors in German-occupied Poland. And Hans Frank was a murderous person. He was a mass murderer, and he ran the death camps. He knew about them. He supported the extermination of Jews and Poles. In fact, if you look into Hans Frank's diary, you will see that his diary was volumes long, dozens of volumes long. It was a huge, huge diary that this guy had. And he damns himself in his own diary. He says that the Jews are a people who need to be eradicated. He said this. So he wanted the Holocaust. He was involved in orchestrating the Holocaust. But after Hans Frank got arrested, all of a sudden he began to present himself as this angel. He began to say, well, I was trying to stop the Holocaust. I was trying to stop the killings. I was trying to put an end to it. It was the SS. The SS was the problem. And so he began to present himself as this tortured soul who was, yes, in the Nazi government, but at the same time he was working to stop the Nazi killings, but he failed and nobody listened to him, and it was just, it was so awful. And I'm this innocent man. Now, of course, the Americans didn't buy it. The people who were interrogating him didn't buy it. They knew he was a liar, and just by looking at his diary, you know that the guy was a liar. But Hans Frank tried to utilize this trick of presenting himself as this tortured soul, when the reality was that he was a mass murderer. And all these different fanatics do this sort of thing. The Bolsheviks presented themselves as the defenders of the peasants, the defenders of the poor, when the reality is that they brought about mass starvation, they brought about mass murder. The French revolutionaries presented themselves as people who were for the betterment of France, the betterment of the peasantry, the betterment of the French working man, and the betterment of the common man, and who were the biggest victims of the French Revolution. The people who were butchered more than anyone else during the French Revolution were the peasants, not the elites, the peasants. So the people that they said they were defending ended up being their biggest victims. So that's what you have to keep in mind before you start becoming a subscriber to some sort of a fanatical cult or ideology. You'll say, well, I really, really like this Luigi Mangione guy. I really like what he stood for. I like the ideology that he subscribed to. I really love this ideology that a lot of people are subscribing to, the ideology that says that killing CEOs is good, or killing certain CEOs is good. Before you jump headfirst into that cesspool of lunacy, understand that when rebels take power, they do the opposite of what they claimed to be doing. They do the opposite of the cause that they claim to uphold. They will claim that they are for the working man, but if they take power, they will be much worse than anything we have right now in American society. Because once you start justifying murder, I'm not talking about the state executing criminals who are worthy of death. I'm not talking about the state killing Ted Bundy. Not talking about that. I am for the death penalty. Once you start justifying murder, when you start justifying the act of a man getting a gun and shooting someone in cold blood, once you justify that, then you justify other murders. Pretty soon, landlords are going to be seen as, well, there's tons of people who want to kill landlords, so there are people who are already justifying the murder of landlords, but they're going to say, well, landlords need to be killed. And the landlords could be seen just as the Bolsheviks saw the kulaks, as worthy of death. So landlords are going to be seen as being worthy of being put before a firing squad. Okay, well, and then you'll say, well, the landlords deserve it because the landlords, well, they own the land, right? They own the houses, and then they extract money from working class people, hard-working people, while they just sit around and do nothing. And that's how the Bolsheviks saw the kulaks. So really, this is another example of what I mean by returning back to the fanaticism of history. And this way of thinking is already present, but the fact that Luigi Mangione is being seen as a hero by so many people tells me that this trend is going to grow and it's going to get worse. And it'll just escalate, right? If this trend continues on and on and on, it'll escalate. So landlords will be seen as worthy of death, and it'll be open season on landlords. Okay, so then who's next? Well, let's say, the church. Well, the Catholic Church has done a whole bunch of corrupt things, and the Catholic Church has covered up for terrible crimes, so the Catholic Church is seen as worthy of destruction. And so, well, what about the Catholics? Well, the priests will be seen as worthy of death. Okay, so it's going to be open season on the priests. Okay, well, what about the regular Catholic lay people? Oh, well, if they are against our revolution, they will also be seen as worthy of death. Okay, so who else will be on the list? The Catholic Church, all the Catholics. Okay, who else? It'll just go on and on and on. So pretty soon, anyone who is deemed as an enemy of the cause, so to speak, will be seen as worthy of death. And if you have this sort of ideology becoming mainstream, well, then you'll have a rebellion. And the rebels will eventually just kill each other. during the French Revolution? You think it was just these righteous upholders of justice and equity and fairness fighting the man and overthrowing tyranny? No, it was a bunch of rebels who were committing acts of tyranny themselves in the name of fighting tyranny. And then the rebels began to kill each other. Who killed Robespierre? So you have to understand that this is how evil works. Evil will always point to other abuses to justify abuse. They will always reference other evils to justify the evils that they want to do. The problem is, every time I bring this up, people come out and prove my point, which is good. I mean, I'm glad that people will prove my point. So, for example, if I say, hey, Syrian rebels are evil, you have people who come along and say, well, Bashar was evil, but you're proving my point. You're pointing to abuses to justify the abuses done by the people that you support. If I say, hey, look, Luigi Mangione is a terrorist and he murdered this CEO and what he did was murder, what he did was evil, people will come out and say, well, United Health did these abuses and did people wrong. And I will say, okay, you're proving my point, though. You're pointing to wrongs that have been done to justify the evils that you praise. So the problem with this way of thinking is that the evil and the destruction will never end. It commences a vicious cycle. So one group of people do some abuses, you come along and do even worse abuses, and then other people will come along and say, you guys did this wrong to me, and they will do abuses. It's like the Lebanese Civil War. The Lebanese had a whole bunch of Palestinian refugees who were living within their borders, living in Lebanon, and Palestinians were mistreated to a certain extent. They were denied employment to a great extent. The only employment that was, generally speaking, given to them in a very large number was construction, and so Palestinians were sort of seen as just worthy of being mainly construction workers. And so Palestinians got sick and tired of this, and guess what happened? The PLO comes in, and the PLO became a mafia, and a lot of Palestinians followed the PLO, and the PLO began to abuse people, began to extort people, take money from people. And so if you had, let's say, a business in an area dominated by the PLO would force you to give them money, and so they became the abusers. So the Palestinians were abused, and then the PLO became popular, and the PLO became the abuser. And so the Maronite Christians in Lebanon were being attacked by Palestinian terrorists, and there were acts of violence done towards Christians. And the Maronites became murderers themselves. So, for example, there was a case where a man's body was found somewhere, I want to say outside of an electrical plant or something like that. And the Maronite militants, these were racist, really. They were members of a group called the Kataib. This was a Maronite paramilitary organization, and they were actually inspired by the Nazis. No surprise there. And so they said, okay, well, a Christian man was killed, his body was found, how are we going to respond to this? And they said, okay, we're going to respond by murdering a whole bunch of Muslims. And so they put up these checkpoints, and if you drove through their checkpoints, or if you drove towards their checkpoints, they would stop you and they would say, okay, are you a Muslim? And if you said yes, they would take the father out of the car and they would slit his throat. And then the Muslims said, okay, the Maronites want to play this game, we're going to do the same thing to Maronites. And so the Muslims set up their checkpoints, and they would stop cars, and if you were a Maronite, they would take the man out of the car and they would slit his throat. And hundreds of people were killed in this manner on both sides, Christian and Muslim. And so the cycle didn't end. It became this vicious cycle. The PLO did atrocities. They did acts of murder and rape and did horrible things. And then the Maronites also did the same sort of thing. And it culminated into what is known as the Sabra and Shatila massacres, in which the Maronites in the year, I want to say 1982, went into the Palestinian refugee camps and for several days committed acts of mass murder and rape. And anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 people were butchered. And I have brought this up, and Lebanese people have come onto my YouTube channel to tell me that the Maronite militia, the Kataib, did nothing wrong. So, and then they will say, well, the PLO did such and such a crime. They did such and such a wrongdoing. And what's going on here? What's going on is people are pointing to abuses to justify their own acts of evil, to justify their own evil desires. This is the problem. This is the problem. And so with this way of thinking, the cycle never ends. So the killing of one CEO is seen as justified. Well, then the list of people who you consider worthy of death is going to now widen. It's going to get bigger. So CEOs of health insurance companies deserve death. So then who's next? Landlords, okay, priests, Catholics, and then guess what? If enough people become atheistic, well, the churches will be seen as worthy of destruction, because the churches promote, according to atheists, the churches promote fantasies. They promote fiction, and they get people to believe in fiction. They get people to believe in lies, and because they get people to believe in lies, they then scare people into believing in the existence of hell, and then they use the existence of hell to convince people to give them money, because they say they tell the Christians, they tell the lay people, the laity, give me money that's going to better your salvation, because you're giving money to the church, and the church is God's instrument on earth by which God spreads the truth to humanity. So then people give the church money to better their own state or better their own status with God, and this is spiritual extortion, or this is getting people or manipulating people into giving them money by feeding them lies and convincing them of believing in lies. So therefore, all churches should be banned, and if you disagree, well, then you are an accomplice in this mass manipulation and this financial scheme, and so therefore you are worthy of death. And so let's bring back death camps for Christians, and let's do exactly what the communists did to Christians. Let's do what the Khmer Rouge did, and just murder a whole bunch of people to better society. And you know what? The list can widen even more. Let's say you believe in climate change, and you believe that if we continue on with the way that we're doing industry and the way that we're doing, if we continue on doing pollution and ruining the environment, we're just going to destroy the whole earth. And there's a lot of people out there who disagree with climate change. And so those people are the ones who are responsible for the destruction of the earth. So those people should be killed, because just as United Health denied people life-saving coverage, and those people's deaths or those people's blood is on the hands of the CEO, well, the destruction of the earth, the coming destruction of the earth, is now on the hands of those who are denying climate change. So those people are now worthy of death in the sick mind of the people who are fanatical followers of environmentalism. If you believe in, let's say, transhumanism, and you think that through transhumanism we can prevent diseases and we can prevent deformities, we can prevent disabilities, and you believe that transhumanism must be imposed, because through transhumanism we can now prevent all these illnesses and deformities and all of these travails that people go through because of genetic deformities, genetic problems. And you believe that in order to get people to be born with genes that will prevent them from getting these issues, embryo selection must be done. So embryos are made in a lab, and then their embryos are conceived in a lab, and the embryos with the best genes that'll prevent them from getting sick are then implanted into women's wombs, and then the rest of the embryos are thrown down in the trash and all this stuff. And you believe that through this process, you will make this society where people will not be born with deformities or sicknesses. Well, then Christians come along and they say, well, we disagree with this. This is playing God. This is genetic manipulation. This is eugenics. And then what's your argument? Your argument is, I am working for the betterment of humanity to prevent illnesses, to prevent handicaps, to prevent disabilities, and you are here hindering this great project of mine, this great project of preventing all of these biological travails. And so now the opposers of transhumanism are seen as what? Enemies of humanity and worthy of death. This is the problem. This is what I'm trying to tell people. Once you start justifying murder, then other murders become justifiable. And it commences a vicious cycle. If all of a sudden it's open season on CEOs, well, CEOs are going to start what? They're going to start hiring big-time security. They're going to start, hiring mercenaries, Blackwater guys to protect them. And if it gets to the point where CEOs are just being shot all the time, CEOs may just start doing, preemptive strikes and killing people before they kill them. I'm speaking of a situation where this sort of thing really, really gets out of hand. My point is, once you start saying a CEO should be killed and you're right to kill them, then the CEO can just say, okay, well, I have a right to kill you because you want to kill me, so I'm going to kill you. And what you do is you commence a vicious cycle that's very, very difficult to end. And the problem is that people are so short-sighted that they just see the situation in front of them and they don't think about the future. So they'll say, okay, United Health denied all these people coverage, therefore CEO bad, therefore it's open season on this CEO, or it's open season on these CEOs. And they think this is great because these CEOs are evil. But the thing is that if you justify murder, then you justify other forms of murder. And people don't think about these things. They don't think about how this ideology will affect the world in the future sense. And so people are just too short-sighted. And the same thing goes with the Syrian revolution. Yes, Bashar al-Assad is bad, and that's all they want to focus on. And so they support a revolution which leads to rebels running around and overrunning the country. That leads to rebels committing acts of mass murder, rape, and then you just say, okay, well, you wanted to overthrow this tyrant because this tyrant was bad, but then you just opened up the floodgates to these demons who are committing all these atrocities. So I thought your whole goal was to end atrocities, but now you've just enabled even more atrocities, even more acts of murder, even more inhumanities. So what was the point? And you've just commenced this vicious cycle. And this is what I mean by people being too short-sighted. And now you're seeing what? Turkey furthering itself militarily in Syria. Turkey has been controlling a portion of northern Syria for years. And now Turkey is going to expand itself even more. And eventually Syria is going to be controlled by Turkey. And you're going to see this revived Ottoman Empire. And you can read about the abuses that Turkey has done in the portion of Syria that it has been militarily occupying. And you can read about how the Kurds have been sexually assaulted, how Kurdish people have been sexually assaulted, murdered, kidnapped for ransom. You can read about how under Turkish occupation, Kurdish farmers have been abused, olive farmers have been abused, their olives get the selling of their olives is completely under the control of the Turks. The Turks force the Kurds to sell their olives at a 20 or 30% discount. And then the olive oil production by the Kurdish farmers or the Kurdish olive oil producers has been completely under the control of the Turks in this area of Syria under Turkish military occupation. People have been just tormented by the Turks and their mercenary proxies. And that's just a sample of what it would be like to be under Turkish rule. But again, people are short-sighted. They don't care about the future. They just care about their own evil desires. They only care about the destructive wants that they have. And so people will say, well, we just want to see Bashar al-Assad gone. but they don't think about the future. They don't care. And they don't really care about the fact that Turkey wants these terrorists to overrun Syria so that Turkey can then have a pretext to say, well, we have to go into Syria and bring order, and that means taking over the country. And you have these Israelis who are very happy about Bashar al-Assad being toppled, and they say, well, Bashar al-Assad needed to be toppled because he was an ally of Hezbollah, and he was allowing his country to be a transit point by which Iran could arm Hezbollah and all these things. So Bashar al-Assad needed to be toppled, blah, 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 but you're only seeing what's in front of you. You're being very short-sighted, because what's going to happen as a result of Bashar al-Assad being toppled? Turkey is going to take over Syria, and now Israel is going to have for its neighbor the second most armed country in NATO, smack right next door to Israel. And you're going to have a revived Ottoman Empire right next to you. And a war with Turkey is not going to be easy. Israel fighting Hezbollah, it's a lot easier. Israel fighting Syria, a lot easier. But Israel versus Turkey would be very, very ugly. And the Israelis right now are laughing. They think everything's going to be great because they think that they can contain the terrorists in Syria. And they think that Turkey is going to be forever on the leash of America. And what they refuse to see, or maybe they do see this, maybe some of them see this, but they're so evil that they don't care. But what a lot of people refuse to see is that America is going through this state of not wanting to police the world. And so America is basically telling the Turks, you run things in Syria. And they're telling the Israelis, go ahead and take territory in Syria, widen your borders. But what is the future going to hold? It's going to hold a clash between Israel and Turkey. They're not friends. These are enemy countries. And it's not going to be Israel versus some terrorist organization. It's going to be Israel versus one of the most armed countries in the world. And it's going to contribute to really the future destruction of Israel in a major, major way. But again, people are short-sighted. They refuse to see the ripple effect of what they do. They refuse to try to at least foresee what the ripple effect is going to be of their actions. So you support the Syrian revolution, you're going to have terrorists overrunning everything. You support the killing of a CEO, you're only going to cause a ripple effect in which fanaticism is going to be seen as something acceptable. And if fanaticism is seen as something acceptable, then you're going to have an intensification of that fanaticism. And then all of a sudden, it's going to be not just CEOs, but it's going to be other people who will be seen as worthy of being targets of assassination. And then from there, it's going to be firing squads for certain people. And then from there, you have mass murder. But people refuse to see. That's the problem. Because they're so evil, they're so drunk off of their own weird and sick ideas that they refuse to see the murder that really lies beneath it all, or the evil that lies beneath it all. And they just don't care. That's the problem with people. They just don't care because they're so caught up in the fanaticism of the current moment. And like I said, the fanaticism that we associate with the past, with the Middle Ages, with the late 18th century, with the French Revolution, or with the mid-20th century, with the Bolsheviks, that fanaticism is coming back. And we are going to go through some very dark times. I hate to say it. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.